Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a Nintendo Switch exclusive that released on the 29th of July 2022, the same day as Digimon Survive, and this did fight hard for my attention. Xenoblade 3 follows the adventures of Noah, a Special Forces soldier fighting for the nation of Keves against the rival Ignarians. He and his friends use futuristic weapons and mechanical constructs to wage war and harvest life energy by killing their opponents. This life energy is then used to sustain the existence of the victors through a mechanism known as a flame clock. This creates a ruthless and endless cycle of death. Noah and his friends meet an enemy unit and set into motion events that leave all 8 members on the battlefield at that time branded enemies of the state, both states, and are pursued relentlessly throughout the game. Most of the story sees Noah, Mio, and their gang of friends on the run looking for answers and allies as they try to stay alive. This concept and premise are just a twist on a high fantasy sci-fi setting, but I can't fault it at all. It might not be easily believable on paper, but the game sells it to you, and then shows it to you, in a way that leaves you needing answers. In particular, Noah does not suffer from the traditional JRPG protagonist curse. He is a likeable character on his own, and can't be classified as annoyingly naive or overly optimistic, while still retaining a sense of purpose to help push the narrative along. His counterpart Mio is the game's emotion. She more readily feels the threat of death than the other characters. Most of the supporting cast around these two fit their roles well also. These do fall into some predictable tropes, such as quiet sidekick, reckless meathead, and overbearing nerd, but none of these are poorly executed. The only character that feels a little off is Tyon, and that's less to do with how he's written, and mostly to do with the visual design. I don't know if intentional or not, but he bears a striking similarity to the protagonist from Persona 5. Xenoblade 3's plot, narrative, and writing are all improvements over its predecessor, Xenoblade 2. While this installment follows a lot of genre stereotypes, it does carry a dark enough tone from the outset that it's a believable world, and one with consequences at that. To keep this mostly spoiler-free, all I'll say is that there is always just enough at stake that you feel compelled to keep going. Yet, often these cutscenes are long and can take you out of the flow of your gaming session. There are also some moments that feel a little forced, and some characters that feel out of place in a world where children are literally raised from birth to be essentially weapons of death. It's worth noting that there is a formula to a lot of what you'll be doing here as well, and the characters you meet are part of that formula. You have little choice but to play along at the game's own cadence, and that rhythm includes some unguided side quests and exploration. I do think this experience is helped by the voice acting though. It's nice to have a good mix of genuine English language accents, and believable ones at that.
I cannot believe eyes! It's fruit of legend! Bright fig!
Bright fig? What's a bright fig when it's at home?
Let me guess. They're stupidly delish.
Each character feels unique, and the voices do help accentuate their personalities. Most of the major story points and plot progression are done in cutscenes, with a smattering of unvoiced ones for certain side quests. This all combines to make a good, if not great, story experience, even if you can see this game's major plot twists coming a mile off. In terms of gameplay, this is your traditional RPG, with a mostly open world to explore. You go from area to area, fighting, freeing people from the Flame Clock's dominion, and finishing quests. These are broken into large regions and then smaller landmark areas. By the end of the game, each map is just full of markers, and trying to explore it all the first time you reach an area will feel like a tedious chore. I did try my best to explore all of these as soon as they unlocked, but the volume of these even surprised me. There's just a lot to see and do here, and some of the most important quests are unlocked by meeting requirements that aren't obvious or intuitive to figure out. In the early stages of the game, your options for gameplay progression and exploration are pretty bare bones, and the game slowly hands out new mechanics and features. This is a drip feed, as Xenoblade spends the first 10 to 15 hours handing out the basics, and then gives you traversal skills at set story points afterwards. What really stands out, even at this early stage, while you're unlocking mechanics, is the weak auto-attack based combat. This system feels like a relic of how MMOs behaved at the turn of the millennium, and at times, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 does feel like a game designed by therapists to wean MMO veterans away from their multiplayer offerings and onto single-player games. This feeling is primarily enforced in the combat as well, but does trickle into the systems and mechanics. At its core, everything in Xenoblade's combat is about slowly building gauges up to full. Even the ones that allow for massive bursts of damage take minutes to execute fully, and they feel incredibly laboured. This is a really nice payoff in a boss battle or when fighting one of the game's elite or unique monsters, but these flashy anime reels got old quickly. Even if you go into a boss battle over-leveled and wearing optimal gear, some of these fights take 15 minutes of hacking away at the boss, and that's just to make a dent. Everything here feels really tanky by design. This is true of the trash mobs in the world too, even though they do die a little faster than the bosses. Even so, you have to start the process as though you're building up to the big finale chain attack, even though your enemy will die before you execute it. At this point, the game is basically edging you, and this combat system doesn't seem to have a good way to quickly clear trash mobs. This was a massive issue I had with Xenoblade 2, but a lot of the players, myself included, looked past it because the blade system in that game was mechanically interesting, and injected an element of randomness into acquiring that game's equivalent of character classes. Fans of the series either loved this or hated it, depending on their own personal experience rolling blades. Here, there's a class system, where you just swap into the class you've unlocked and level up their rank with each character. This is not objectively worse, as both perform the exact same function mechanically. However, with the class system, you aren't relying on R&G to hand you more ways to fight, or cool weapons and abilities. Instead, you're doing optional hero quests and unlocking them. These add further skills and abilities to your arsenal, which expand the number of moves and skills available to you. You can rank up these classes and unlock even greater power still, and in the process allow other party members to learn the job also. Some of these heroes that you inherit classes from are even available as companions to take out into the field, taking your total party count up from 6 to 7, and allowing you to choose between letting your main party work on that role, or have another NPC fill the flex slot and either be an additional tank, healer, or DPS. In the early game, I disliked this class system as it felt more restrictive and scripted than the Living Blade system from 2, but towards the mid and end game, I had been converted. The addition of extra abilities and a wider variety of weapons allow you to change combat from a slow auto-attacking slog that can be played with one hand and an eye on the TV, to a more hands-on, fast-paced experience that kept me invested longer than it had any right to. If you pick the right classes and the right accessories, you can turn trash clearing into a shorter experience, which in turn nullified my earlier gripe. A large part of this game's progression lies on build creation, party class composition, and then additional buffs through leveling up gems, skills, and accessories. More slots for the latter open up at higher levels, and there are a lot of layers to this. Even with all of these systems unlocked, there's an undeniable slowness that undercuts a lot of the game in cutscenes, side quests, and combat. It's unavoidable that this is going to put some people off, even if JRPGs are your bread and butter. This game desperately needed a ruthless sub-editor to come in and apply the word concise to almost every aspect of it, as even the mechanically interesting parts of this game start to become little annoyances when drawn out and overstaying their welcome. The spectacle of Xenoblade 3 is very similar to Xenoblade 2, with a cleaner UI the most noticeable improvement. Xenoblade 2's characters did have a bit more colour to them, as the blades were at times walking representations of their elemental affiliation. Here, the costumes for each class more closely fit the black and white aesthetic of these warring nations, and don't quite pop on your screen in the same way, Kamaravi being a notable exception. The environments in 3 have a bit more verticality to them though. While this does make the map a little more confusing, it's not too inconvenient if you combine referring to that with actual exploration. This game lacks some quality of life features, but it's certainly not devoid of them. The combat is unique, but lacks a sharpness that ages it more than it should. This isn't helped by how busy the screen can feel at times, and trying to get any sort of perspective on the battlefield while playing in handheld mode is just difficult. I found that the story and characters were the real appeal here, and Noah and Mio's quest was more than enough to get me past the extended tutorial the game presents. The auto-battle system is competent, not good, and the AI is guilty of ignoring basic RPG rules like face the boss away from the party. This is at least 40 hours of game, and my own playtime took me more than 85, but I did try to do as much as I could before the game fatigue set in, and it did set in. I do consider my purchase of this game well spent, and prefer this game's story to Xenoblade 2, which got a little too into its waifus at the end, as did Rex, so it seems. Ultimately, there's not much difference here between Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 as you would like, graphically, yet the changes to most of the mechanics here are undeniable upgrades on a system that was fairly good to begin with. I only find it difficult to recommend Xenoblade Chronicles 3 as a whole package, because for everything I like about this game, something else frustrated me just enough to temper my praise. This game demands hundreds of hours of your time if you want to get close to 100% clear, and eventually trying to do all these things as and when they became available to me sucked a lot of the enjoyment out of the game, as it devolved to relentless box ticking. The combat, exploration, and sheer volume of content here are no doubt impressive, but in practice they will only resonate with people who are wired in a certain way. You will most certainly know already if that is you.